Welcome to Casey Quiz. It's the 100-question opposite word quiz from easy to impossible. Quick reminder, subscribe to our channel for exciting quizzes. Ready? Begin. Let's start with easy. What is the opposite of up? Down. What is the opposite of big? Small. What is the opposite of fast? Slow. What is the opposite of hot? Cold. What is the opposite of inside? Outside. What is the opposite of old? Young. What is the opposite of happy? Sad. What is the opposite of day? Night. What is the opposite of true? False. What is the opposite of love? Hate. What is the opposite of full? Empty. What is the opposite of near? Far. What is the opposite of loud? Quiet. What is the opposite of heavy? Light. What is the opposite of buy? Sell. What is the opposite of give? Take. What is the opposite of clean? Dirty. What is the opposite of start? End. What is the opposite of right? Wrong. What is the opposite of open? Closed. What is the opposite of short? Tall. What is the opposite of wet? Dry. What is the opposite of hard? Soft. What is the opposite of high? Low. What is the opposite of yes? No. Time to level up. This is level normal. Things are getting a little trickier now. What is the opposite of admit? Deny. What is the opposite of arrive? Depart. What is the opposite of careful? Careless. What is the opposite of defeat? Victory. What is the opposite of friend? Enemy. What is the opposite of generous? Selfish. What is the opposite of guilty? Innocent. What is the opposite of permanent? Temporary. What is the opposite of shallow? Deep. What is the opposite of victory? Defeat. What is the opposite of expand? Shrink. What is the opposite of elegant? Awkward. What is the opposite of capture? Release. What is the opposite of cruel? Kind. What is the opposite of common? Rare. What is the opposite of artificial? Natural. What is the opposite of visible? Invisible. What is the opposite of create? Destroy. What is the opposite of praise? Criticize. What is the opposite of foreign? Native. What is the opposite of ancestor? Descendant. What is the opposite of courage? Fear. What is the opposite of failure? Success. What is the opposite of liquid? Solid. What's the opposite of modern? Ancient. You've made it this far. Prepare for level hard. What is the opposite of compulsory? Optional. What is the opposite of deteriorate? Improve. What is the opposite of exaggerate? Understate. What is the opposite of flaunt? Conceal. What is the opposite of gratitude? Ingratitude. What is the opposite of inevitable? Avoidable. What is the opposite of modest? Arrogant. What is the opposite of opaque? Clear. What is the opposite of precarious? Safe. What is the opposite of tranquil? Agitated. What is the opposite of authentic? Counterfeit. What is the opposite of candid? Secretive. What is the opposite of endorse? Renounce. What is the opposite of flawless? Flawed. What is the opposite of hostile? Friendly. What is the opposite of lethargic? Energetic. What is the opposite of mitigate? Worsen. What is the opposite of novice? Expert. What is the opposite of perpetual? Fleeting. What is the opposite of succumb? Resist. What is the opposite of verbose? Concise. What is the opposite of adversity? Prosperity. What is the opposite of cautious? Reckless. What is the opposite of docile? Stubborn. What is the opposite of efface? Emphasize. This is the final test. Level impossible. Let's see if you can crack these advanced words. What is the opposite of zenith? Nadir. What is the opposite of acrimony? Goodwill. What is the opposite of alacrity? Slowness. What is the opposite of benevolent? Malicious. What is the opposite of capricious? Consistent. What is the opposite of debacle? Success. What is the opposite of ebullient? Subdued. What is the opposite of fortuitous? Planned. What is the opposite of gregarious? Reserved. What is the opposite of incredulous? Believing. What is the opposite of judicious? Foolish. What is the opposite of obsolete? Modern. What is the opposite of palliative? Intensifying. What is the opposite of querulous? Cheerful. What is the opposite of scintillating? Dull. What is the opposite of tacit? Explicit. What is the opposite of ubiquitous? Scarce. What is the opposite of vex? Delight. What is the opposite of wane? Wax. What is the opposite of zeal? Apathy. What is the opposite of altruistic? Selfish. What is the opposite of clandestine? Open. What is the opposite of diffident? Confident. What is the opposite of eminent? Unknown. What is the opposite of frugal? Extravagant. Quiz complete. That's 100 opposites done. Post your score and tell me which level was the hardest. Like and subscribe to Casey Quiz for the next one.